Sometimes, it feels as though there are only 3 things that anyone talks about these days: Taylor Swift, VAR, and Alfie working too many hours wasting his life away, making silly little videos about football. Alright, maybe I should get out the house more, but even beyond the 4 walls of the HITC Sevens household, it has been impossible to escape the VAR discourse over the past week. From Pitcairn Islands in the southern Pacific Ocean to the deepest depths of the North Korean countryside, all anyone has been able to talk about is how Luis Díaz was clearly onside, and how his goal being disallowed is the single greatest injustice, and ongoing question marks surrounding VAR the most pressing and existential crisis facing mankind in 2023. As Indonesia burns to the ground, New York sinks into the ocean, and Vladimir Putin threatens to deploy nuclear weapons in Ukraine, it is hard to disagree. Having already apologised for missing Andre Onana's foul in injury time earlier this season, which should have seen Wolves awarded a penalty against Manchester United, now the PGMOL has apologised to Liverpool, issuing a statement in which they acknowledge that significant human error had occurred, and that they would conduct a full review into the circumstances, which led to the error in question. The term XA is no longer used to mean expected assists, but expected apologies, and with 2 of them already just 7 weeks into the season, we could be on course for a very high XA campaign indeed. Still, at least we have got our brightest minds working hard to come up with innovative long-term solutions.
Shut up! How's about you don't bother with all this sideshow and just get your guys by the scruff of the neck and say, for God's sake, do your job. Yeah.
Aye, that'll do it, Craig. Problem solved. On the off chance that grabbing officials by the scruff of their necks and telling them to do their jobs doesn't fix the problem, and I too would be shocked if that was the case, I figured that after 4 and a bit years, it was time to revisit VAR on this channel. Whilst I am much older and wiser, of course, the rage around VAR seems only to have intensified during that time, with increased question marks surrounding its application, interpretation, and whether it should even exist at all. Very quickly, just before we begin, I have been nominated for the Best Content Creator at the 2023 Football Content Awards, up against such esteemed figures as the Irish guy, Mark Goldbridge, and Rory Jennings. Voting closes at midnight on Sunday, but if you think I deserve it, I will leave a link to vote down in the video description, and you can also vote on Instagram as well. Cheers. The introduction of VAR was heralded as a great leap forward for football, bringing the game into the 21st century and in line with other sports like rugby, tennis and cricket, where video assistant referees have been used relatively uncontroversially to assist on-field officials for a number of years. But not unlike China's own great leap forward, it has come at a significant cost. Thankfully, not an estimated 15 to 55 million deaths caused by famine, it hasn't been quite that bad, but it has upset a lot of football fans, which... No, you're right, it's not remotely comparable, is it? The idea of video assistant referees in football was first floated almost 20 years ago, and it reared its ugly head every time there was an extremely controversial decision in a very consequential fixture from that point on. Already, by the time that a blatant Thierry Henry handball saw France qualify for the 2010 World Cup in South Africa at the Republic of Ireland's expense, it felt as though VAR, in some way, shape or form, had become inevitable. The pressure was simply too great. At the time, few were calling for perfection. The idea behind VAR, in theory at least, is that it should only exist to rectify clear and obvious errors made by on-field officials. You could be forgiven for not realising it, but that is still the MO from IFAB, the International Football Association Board, who determine the laws of the game of association football. Even at the start of this season, you may recall that one of the reforms that PGMOL chief Howard Webb was keen to emphasise ahead of the new campaign was that VAR would be implemented with a lighter touch. It was another way of re-emphasising that initial commitment to only rectifying clear and obvious errors, and that seemed to last for all of about 1 game week. According to IFAB, even offside decisions should only be subject to VAR intervention in the case of clear and obvious errors. Under the second section of IFAB's VAR protocol, entitled Reviewable Match-Changing Decisions/Incidents, IFAB's laws state, quote, "The referee's original decision will not be changed unless there was a clear and obvious error. Brackets, this includes any decision made by the referee based on information from another match official, e.g. offside." Close bracket, end quote. By that logic, one could argue that VAR was actually right not to intervene in the Tottenham vs Liverpool game last weekend, given that it was, relatively speaking, quite a tight offside decision. Certainly you would be hard-pressed to say that it was a clear and obvious error in real time, and the on-field linesman flagged for offside. Of course, that's not how the laws have actually been implemented, otherwise the PGMOL wouldn't have apologised, and practically every single goal scored in the Premier League wouldn't be subject to at least a cursory VAR offside check, which brings us to the crux of one of the major issues with VAR. If the interpretation of what is a clear and obvious error is neither clear nor obvious, then what hope is there of VAR being clear and obvious in its application? VAR was first trialled in the early 2010s, it was approved by IFAB in 2016 and utilised at both the 2017 Confederations Cup and the 2018 World Cup in Russia. It was proposed by some as a trade-off between interruption and minor delays, which threatened to upset the rhythm of a game and the entertainment, but would ensure perfect decisions. On the balance of things, most people concluded that the interruptions and delays were a price worth paying, and though there was some opposition, by the time Premier League teams voted in favour of introducing VAR in English football's top flight ahead of the 2019-20 season, it enjoyed relatively overwhelming support, at least for such a radical alteration to the way in which the sport is officiated. Personally, whilst never particularly bothered either way, I concluded following the 2018 World Cup that, on the balance of things, VAR was probably a net benefit. It seemed pretty slick, there weren't too many controversial calls, and the interruption was fairly minimal. It is worth just noting that there were only 21 VAR reviews across the entire 2018 World Cup, and just 2 during the knockout stage. The clear and obvious doctrine was still being adhered to much more strongly at the time. Referees also appeared to have a lot more muscle than they do now. Figuratively speaking, of course, they didn't all look like Mr. Olympia competitors. Of the 11 occasions in which the referee was called over to the monitor to review a penalty decision which they hadn't awarded initially, they gave penalties on 8 occasions, but stuck to their guns on 3, refusing to overturn their initial decision. In the Premier League, by contrast, you have got a better chance of seeing Johnny Evans score a perfect hat-trick, or of Chelsea exercising some degree of caution in the transfer market, than you have of seeing an on-field referee defy the recommendations of VAR. Ultimately, the proposed trade-off between delays and perfect officiating was always a false dichotomy. Not only is there no such thing as perfect officiating, it is often the case that there is no such thing as a perfect decision, even in isolation, as we see when a studio of pundits or a group of football fans can't reach the same conclusion, even after seeing multiple freeze frames and slow motion replays of the exact same incident. Perfect officiating is like the perfect manager, player or team. No such thing exists, and it is a pipe dream to imagine that it ever will. Likewise, VAR is often referred to as technology, and whilst there is an element of technology, of course, in the end, all it does is allows another human to analyse an incident in closer detail, and humans, I'm sorry to report, are always going to be fallible. Obviously, that doesn't mean that because perfect isn't possible, we shouldn't strive for better quality officiating, or that what we have now is the best that it could possibly be, but it is just worth noting, as we will come on to, and I know that this isn't a popular view, officiating is probably the best that it has ever been. Nonetheless, it is extraordinary that the reason the video assistant referee didn't carry out an offside check, in this instance we're told, is because he thought that the goal had already been awarded. I don't mind when the referee on £10 an hour at 7-a-side doesn't spot the opposition goalkeeper, who is wearing gardening gloves, has stepped outside of his box, and therefore we ought to have had a penalty because he's decided to watch the game on the adjacent pitch instead because we're all rubbish. But at the elite level, even as someone who tends to stick up for officials, you've got to say that's a bit of a howler. It is the refereeing equivalent of Roberto Baggio's penalty miss in the 1994 World Cup final. So what is the solution? Well, over the past few days, we have seen lots of them. So it's probably worth going through some of the main ones and pointing out why they also won't work. Perhaps the most popular suggestion of all is for the dialogue between the referee and the VAR officials to be played out loud in the stadium and on commentary. The feed from the officials is already made available to broadcasters and can be heard by commentators and co-commentators during games. It just isn't broadcast to viewers. Personally, I have no problem with the audio being broadcast live and on television, but I'm not sure what problem people imagine that it will fix in terms of the decisions themselves. I suppose the idea there is that if the process becomes more transparent, it will become more professional and scientific because of the additional scrutiny. But I'm not sure that's the case. Contrary to popular opinion, officials are already doing their best to come to the right conclusion. Despite what the conspiracists might imagine, Darren England isn't telling Simon Hooper that Luis is in fact definitely onside, but someone in his FPL mini-league captained him this week, so if he could just overlook it, that would be doing him a solid. Or that he's got Spurs in his acca and can't be taking any risks, or, most popular of all, that he just passionately detests Liverpool and wants to see them lose. I am using the most recent example there, but you can mix and match the clubs for whatever the prevailing conspiracy theory just so happens to be on any given weekend. Another train of thought is that by making the communication between officials audible to fans in the stadium and watching on television, whether or not they agree with the decision, supporters will know why the officials reached the conclusions that they did and will therefore be more understanding. Now, I don't know whether the people who make this claim have met football fans before, but they must have met different ones to me. There is someone who sits behind me at Hull City every week who is absolutely adamant that the Football Association are trying their damnedest to keep Hull City out of the Championship playoff places this season for, reasons, and that linesmen and women are doing their bidding. He also thinks that playing the ball out from the back is woke, and that refugees are the reason why his wife left him and won't let him see the kids anymore, so I wouldn't take anything that he says as gospel, but that is sort of the point. Football fans are incredibly tribal and irrational, with that tribalism and irrationality only becoming deeper and deeper entrenched with time, particularly online, as I covered in a recent video about football's increased cult-like qualities and tendencies. The idea, for one, that they would patiently listen to the officials and carefully consider their thoughts, rather than jeering and whistling if they were considering a decision which would disadvantage their team is, I think, unlikely, shall we just say, and the idea that they would be much more understanding of the final decision that the officials reached because they had heard them make it, even if it went against their team, seems to me to be almost absurd. Again, I'm not personally opposed to it being introduced. Transparency is generally a net positive, but it's not going to make VAR any more accurate or the decisions of officials any less controversial. In fact, it is perfectly feasible that it could make them even more controversial, within the stadiums at least, which is likely why calls for it to be introduced have so far been resisted. Next up is the call for more automated tech. Goal line technology is the gold standard for this, at least when they remember to turn it on, but unfortunately, not everything is that straightforward. At the 2022 World Cup, we saw semi-automated offside technology used with a sensor inside of the World Cup ball to determine exactly when the ball was struck, and 12 dedicated tracking cameras strategically placed around the stadium to track the ball and 29 points on the body of each individual player. That ball and body point data is then processed in real time via artificial intelligence and alerts VAR whenever there is an offside. That same technology can be used to create an animation for viewers at home and in the stadium, showing them exactly why a player is judged to have been in an on or offside position. At the World Cup, it appeared to work pretty well, but it is a little bit odd to see the PGMOL or officials themselves being blamed for it not being implemented in the Premier League when it was the clubs themselves who voted against it being introduced this season. Basically, if you think that semi-automated offsides using sensors, cameras and AI are preferable to VAR officials drawing lines on a screen, those officials probably agree with you, but you should take it up with your clubs, not them. Another suggestion, in light of last weekend's shenanigans, is that VAR be given more time to make decisions, which is somewhat ironic that for so long the argument was that they needed to be sped up, or that teams should be able to make emergency calls if they feel as though they've been wronged. Even when VAR first reared its head in 2018, and I thought that it was probably a net benefit, I always thought that the challenge system, where a team could oppose a certain number of decisions during a game, retaining challenges if the initial decision was proven to have been inaccurate, would have been a much better system. It would effectively have imposed the clear and obvious mantra, since teams would be unlikely to challenge decisions unless they were of great significance or they were absolutely sure that they were right, and it would therefore keep the rest of the game relatively VAR free. As with any rule, it could probably be abused by teams making fraudulent challenges towards the end of matches to try and slow games down and halt the opposition's momentum, though doing so could well come back to bite them if a contentious decision went against them at the death and they weren't able to make a challenge. Simon Jordan, yes, that one, the renowned public intellectual and TalkSport host who once self-funded a movie starring Kevin Spacey and James Corden, claimed on his and Jim White's radio show that the solution was to scrap VAR protocols. According to Jordan, the fact that the referee cannot revisit a decision after play has been resumed, and therefore VAR cannot alert him that they have made a mistake, was the crux of the problem in the Tottenham vs Liverpool game. Jordan claimed that, even in spite of those protocols, if VAR and the referee had simply ignored them, halted play after the game had been restarted, and said, "Look, we're really sorry, we mucked it up, that wasn't actually offside, it's 1-0 Liverpool," everyone would have said fair enough. Jordan sometimes appears to have a visceral hatred of football fans, owing to his spell as owner of Crystal Palace, but it seems as though he not only doesn't like them, he also doesn't understand them. That would have been just as, if not most likely even more controversial, and would be an unmanageable precedent to set. It is bad enough that in the Premier League, when a goal is scored or disallowed, fans aren't quite sure whether that decision will stand until play restarts. The idea that even after play is restarted, fans would still have to be open to the possibility of the referee halting play and awarding or chalking off a goal is totally absurd. No, none of the leading suggestions would fix VAR, so to speak, and that's because VAR is a solution that doesn't work to a problem that will never be solved. Any mechanism of VAR, aside perhaps from semi-automated offsides, and at least until our AI overlords kill us all and create their own version of football, will be subject to human review, human interpretation, and therefore human error. The reality is that officials get most decisions, including most big decisions, right. I know that too isn't a popular opinion, but it's true, and it is unsurprising. In the words of Roy Keane, that's your job. For all of the criticism they receive, referees' performances are very heavily scrutinised, and those refereeing in the Premier League didn't get there by accident. It was because their performances at non-league level and throughout the EFL. They will still get a few decisions wrong here and there, including the odd major decision and absolute howler, and every team will continue to think that refs hate them more than anyone else, or that there is some grand conspiracy to defraud them of success. The idea that referees are secretly conspiring to help Tottenham, of all teams, popularised over the past week is particularly amusing, given that Spurs haven't won anything for the last 15 years. It would suggest that if referees were corrupt in favour of them, they're not very good at corruption. Everyone is constantly aggrieved, everyone thinks that their team is the most hard done to by referees, and football fans have become as conspiratorial as Alex Jones subscribers, or the people who think that having a pharmacy within a 15-minute walk of their house is akin to Stalinism. Not only has VAR not changed any of that, things have only got worse over the last 4 or 5 years, which begs the question, what is the point? If VAR creates an air of uncertainty inside of stadiums, undermines the matchday officials, slows the game down, creates unnecessary delays and interruptions, and prevents fans from automatically being able to celebrate magical moments without a sense of nagging doubt in the back of their minds, preventing them from going full limbs without actually making any meaningful difference to the standard of officiating, the number of decisions that are perceived as having been called right, or any sense of justice among football fans, players, and managers, surely it would be better to just do away with the whole thing and accept that officiating will never be perfect, crack on with it, and make football fun again. Everyone will whinge when a decision goes against them, as they already do, but eventually they'll move on, and at least we don't have to deal with all of the other negatives that come with VAR. That is the conclusion that I reached in July 2019, a month before VAR was introduced to the Premier League, when I made my last video about VAR. 4 and a bit years on, I have seen nothing to change my mind, and plenty to strengthen that opinion. As a match-going fan of a championship club, I really cannot emphasise enough just how much more enjoyable an experience it is when the ball hits the back of the net and the linesman's flag stays down and the referee waves on, to know that a goal has been scored and to be able to celebrate that goal in the moment, but it is more than just that. Goals are the big one, as the most climactic moment in most games of football, but there is an air of nervousness and dread around stadiums where VAR is in use that can be hard to explain, and I don't think that it can benefit the officials themselves. Human nature dictates that they will be second-guessing what VAR might do at any moment, therefore allowing it to influence their on-field decisions. Unfortunately though, VAR is a bit like herpes or Japanese knotweed. Once you've got it, you're stuck with it. And I think the odds of it ever being removed after several years in operation are close to zero. It's often said that the standard of officiating has never been lower. It is repeated like a mantra, as though, if people say it enough times, it will become an established fact. And in some ways it has. The reality, however, is quite different. If this is the low point of refereeing and officiating, when do people imagine the high point was? At the 1930 World Cup, when the referee accidentally blew the final whistle 6 minutes early when France were through on goal, in 1982, when Harold Schumacher nearly killed Patrick Battiston in one of the most brutal collisions ever witnessed on a football pitch, knocking out 2 of his teeth, cracking 3 of his ribs, damaging his vertebrae and knocking him unconscious, only for the referee to wave play on. Maybe it was closer to the present day, sometime like 2005, when this Roy Carroll fumble was deemed not to have crossed the line, in 2006, when Graham Poll somehow managed to hand Croatia's Josip Simunic 3 separate yellow cards, or as recently as 2014, when Andre Mariner accidentally sent off Kieran Gibbs because he thought he was Alex Oxlade-Chamberlain. It's not that the standard of refereeing has declined, it's that the level of scrutiny has multiplied by an order of magnitude. To help illustrate my point, I have created this extremely scientific graph in conjunction with NASA scientists and statisticians at Cambridge University, plotting the standard of refereeing versus the level of scrutiny over time. I know, the results are pretty shocking. The advent of television and the widespread televising of football matches was bad enough, in terms of pundits and commentators showing 15 different freeze frames and slow-motion replays before chastising the officials for having got the wrong decision in real time, but social media has taken things to a whole new level. Whilst there is little to support the claim that the standard of refereeing has never been lower, and these things are monitored, the manner, personality, and style of refereeing have all changed over a relatively short period of time. It's not uncommon to hear players complain that referees have become too robotic, often interpreting that as an arrogance or lack of personality. And, in some cases, sure, maybe it is. By and large, though, that is a change that has been brought about because of calls from players, managers, and clubs themselves for referees to be more standardised and consistent. One minute, you have people calling for referees to exercise common sense, whatever that means to them, and either let something go for the good of the game or book someone to try and regain control, game management as it is sometimes referred to, but the next minute, there is outcry about a lack of consistency. If that's a yellow card, then how come that tackle a minute ago wasn't? If he's going to let that go, why did he send our left back off in relatively similar circumstances just 3.5 years ago? All we want is consistency, goddammit. Ultimately, it is the same false dichotomy as is presented by VAR. There is no such thing as perfect consistency. No 2 games of football, no 2 tackles, and no 2 fouls are identical. Everything, except for goal line technology pretty much, is open to interpretation. What those in the game have done, therefore, is sacrifice personable referees who are able to use their experience to manage a game in the name of an unattainable goal which leaves no one satisfied. It is the worst of both worlds. The only meaningful way of improving the standard of refereeing, surprisingly enough, isn't to grab officials by the scruff of their necks and tell them to do their jobs. It is to pay them more and abuse them less, particularly at the grassroots level, so as to encourage more people to get into refereeing in the first place. Right now, in many countries, including here in England, as I covered in a video a little while back, football is running out of referees, and the shortage of referees is the biggest threat to the standard of officiating. More referees means more competition, and since only the best rise to the top, inevitably, a higher standard of refereeing in the Premier League and EFL. Fewer referees means a dearth of competition and talent, and lower standards being required to reach the top. The Luton Town manager Rob Edwards recently stated in a press conference, quote, "I am for VAR, as long as it gets the right decisions," end quote. And that just about sums it up. VAR was introduced with a promise that it has not only failed to fulfill, but could never and will never be able to fulfill. To expect perfection from referees is no more or less reasonable than to expect perfection from players or from Rob Edwards himself. VAR has undermined officials, creating a secondary source of authority and a notion that there is, or must be, a right decision in all instances. The reality is that, in some cases, the 5 best referees on the planet could all watch the same incident and they wouldn't necessarily come to the same conclusion. It is in the nature of football and of refereeing. Therefore, we have undermined referees and further inflated expectations of officials to totally unrealistic standards, and for what? Officials still get most decisions right and a few wrong, just as it always was, and just as it always will be. One week you might get screwed, and another week you might get lucky. The same thing still happens, but now it's all that we talk about for the following week, and you can't celebrate goals without that sense of doubt in the back of your mind. What a trade-off, eh? Anyway, that is my VAR rambling done for at least the next 4 years. I'm sure some of you will agree, I'm sure some of you will disagree, but either way, vote for me in the Football Content Awards, where there is a clear and obvious deserved winner, and some justice can be carried out. Thank you all very much, as ever, for watching. Hit the like button if you enjoyed it. Let me know your thoughts down below in the comments. And of course, make sure that you're subscribed and have notifications turned on for both this channel, HITC Sevens, and my second channel, Alfie Potsama, both of which should be on or about to appear on your screens now, along with a couple of videos that you might fancy watching after this one. You can also find me on Twitter, Instagram, or Threads via the username at HITC Sevens on all 3, and all of those links that I just mentioned, plus the option of voting for me in those awards, can be found down in the video description below. Cheers!